So for those of you that made it into the auditorium before the sponsor started to talk, was it difficult coming back from coffee and seeing on the screens that you had to go sit somewhere specific? Was it difficult being told where you could go? What if you left a bag before coffee at your seat, and then you came back and you had to go find it, pick it up, move it, go sit somewhere else? What if you want to sit with your mates, but you've got different hair colors, so you have to go sit on the other side? What about couples? My lovely friends from Baja, California, sir. Beautiful blonde Brian, definitely brunette Sergio. Are you sitting together? You're not. I'm impressed. Thank you. Well, it's more about the whole color thing, the spectrum. If you're not an absolute ultimate fairhead or deep dark brunette, where do you fit? What if you're mousy brown, like me? Or me when I have some hair. But, you know, where is that? It's not quite fair, it's not quite dark. What if you're brown with blonde highlights? What if you're a bottle blonde? So you sit on the fair side, then someone sees your dark roots and says, hey, you got to sit on that side. And that's the whole absurdity of it all. And what if you're bald? What about the baldies? Where do you go? We don't know what color your hair is. So who are we to determine what your identity is and where you belong?
So, you know, as silly as that seems, that's the nub of the adversity that I faced in trying to enter the tourism sector. In fact, not just the tourism sector, but my entire adult working life. I suppose I don't look African to you. I'm certainly not European. Let's face it. Not a typical African-looking person. But yeah, that is the confusion that I had. You see, in South Africa, I was equivalent to the baldies. Where are you? That's okay, you don't have to show yourself, but that's how I felt. Yeah? I was equivalent to the baldies, and that was the craziness of the rules. It just made the rules seem all that more absurd. But I think Kira and I are here to try and paint a picture to you of the adversity, I suppose, that we faced and how we did well enough to be here in Ireland, far, far away from the southern tip of Africa, well enough to address an esteemed audience like yourself, people who are dynamic and successful. And so our story, though, is one where we had to overcome this adversity, and we had to go through some tough terrain, all the while by trying to do right, doing right by our families, doing right by a community, and doing right by our country.
So I did a bit of drama in high school. So I know from that time that what Peter and I are doing here was criminal. Black and white standing on the same stage, addressing an audience at the same time. This was illegal. So how did we come here? How did we make it, actually?
I don't know.
You know, how did we come to stand on an international stage representing, as Nikki said, the Rainbow Nation? I don't know if you've heard that before she said it, and I'm repeating it, that South Africans are sometimes called the Rainbow Nation. It was a phrase that came from Desmond Tutu. After the results, the counting of our 1994 election, our first democratic election, he said, "I am walking on clouds. It is an amazing feeling, like falling in love. We are going to be the rainbow people of the world."
And so it's 20 years this very year that South Africa is a true democracy. And so we are a long way from the scenario of the blondes on one side and the brunettes on the other. And so we'll happily try to reveal a story about a more modern and contemporary South Africa to you. A story of our hearts, our challenges, our pride. But do we also tell you the story of the pain of our past? It's also 20 years that Spirit of Africa was founded. And these two stories are so intertwined with one another. You know, during apartheid, South Africa was like an island, obviously not like the beautiful country island that we're in now, but an island that was isolated and cut off from the world, isolated by policy. Policies, embargoes, sanctions. We lost touch with progression and development. Except for the political scandal, South Africa and South Africans were really unknown. But this, I suppose, I don't know if you can think of the extent of such isolation. Not just the arms embargoes, or not just the economic sanctions where a company like Pepsi was forced to pull out of the country, but also cultural sanctions and sports sanctions where we didn't have pop concerts or writers or exhibitions, where we didn't play test match rugby, and we weren't given the opportunity as Springboks to beat the All Blacks like we did the other day. Sorry, I had to chuck that in. But yes, can you just imagine the extent of that? Not only did we have sanctions like that, but of course, there was no tourism. And so this might, sound crazy to you, but really we were so isolated that people didn't know South Africa or South Africans. But it meant that in 1994, though, tourism had this huge, huge possibility and potential. And of course, Mandela walked our streets.
So many tour operators saw this potential, and they poured their hearts and souls into building products and building companies. And this soon became a tide. And my father was one of them, and he saw the opportunity, but he also was one that looked a little bit deeper and saw two additional rather important things. One of them was that tourism has the true potential to be a proper trickle-down economy. In a place like South Africa at that time, this was so important. It was just what we needed, because the economy was held in the hands of a small minority. So the risk was there also that the tourism dollar wouldn't get beyond the confines of the formal tourism and hospitality sector and really trickle down and really feed at a grassroots level. And the problem was that apartheid had deliberately undereducated the majority of the population. So this was to reduce competition for white people in the job market, and also, as the government said, because black people were not made for sophisticated work. What it meant was that people lacked skills. So in the formal economy, it was very difficult to get jobs. So no matter how in love we were, as Desmond Tutu said, after our democracy, it still didn't help people get access to the workplace, to raise their incomes and improve their lives. But tourism allows this just by knowing yourself, knowing your communities, knowing your culture, knowing your history, knowing your traditions, knowing your languages, knowing your crafts. All of this has value, and that's just at the very basic level. It gives you value, it gives your products value, it gives your singing value, it gives your entertainment value. And then you also can get into very basic entry-level jobs from this point, and that'll upskill you, and you get to a point where you can get promotions in the formalized tourism sector. And what about tips? praise heaven for tips. They trickle and trickle and trickle. But, sorry, Peter, I've got a little bit more to say. The second thing that he saw was that tourists don't just carry wallets. They carry with them all their accumulated knowledge, experience, a lifetime in careers. And this is seldom tapped into whilst they're on holiday. So my dad saw this as an opportunity to bring the two together. And tourism was a vehicle that could provide from this. Our people wanted to learn from visitors. Don't just come and look. Come and tell me about what you know. Share with me how to do things. Where on the internet can I find this? What if I'm a nurse? Are there journals I can access? And how do I get to those journals? So people want to ask each other questions and sit across from each other and talk rather than just look. And the other thing is, Africans don't just beg. They have, by weird force of circumstance, developed innovations, coping mechanisms, local specialities that have stunned some of our eminent guests. So this two-way exchange of knowledge was a way that we saw could be mined to mutual value in the tourism relationship between locals and foreigners. Sorry, I'm trying to hold too many things in my hand. And not only that, we saw that in the local communities of South Africa, that the most dire and pressing needs were actually a combination of money and skills, funding and knowledge. And again, tourism was a way that could meet this need that was unusual for a commercial activity. And so my dad, at the time, tenaciously pursued establishing Spirit of Africa's niche in a peer-to-peer connection that really allowed for a sharing of knowledge and a building of relationships across the local and foreign divide. So from the very first tour, we built in time and made sure there was time for people to meet each other, to share their skills, to point each other in the right direction, and most importantly, also for South Africans to show how they do things to the foreigners that are usually kind of seen as more important. We were able to showcase the beauty of the country, like you need to do in tourism, whilst facilitating the flow of opportunity, both financial and intellectual, in a genuine and cooperative manner before it was demanded by the industry as it's becoming now. And so that was just the start of how we started investing in the human face of tourism. If you look up to operators in South Africa today, almost any one of them, you will find their corporate social responsibility or corporate social investment programs. They're everywhere. And thankfully, for the most part, they are done very, very well. But this is now the law. 20 years ago, we imbued it into the company because it was right. So with this foresight, the company then faced quite a lot more adversity. One is not common to the rest of you, and that was a historical antipathy towards South Africa. But the second two are maybe things you've experienced too, typically. Access to markets, so my dad was an architect, so not really in the industry, and then capital. So he self-guided in a small vehicle, his own, for a long, long time. And I think that might be a story some of you have gone through yourselves, or maybe the founders of your company went through. But for Peter, it was very different.
Yeah, for me, really, the challenges I faced was twofold. Firstly, myself. I had this lack of self-worth and belief in myself. This lack was so embedded in me through an education system and a community upbringing, thinking that one, or teaching a kid that you are more inferior to one person or more superior than the other. So from young, this was embedded to you, and this is what you believed. So I had this demons of myself that I had to overcome to try and get into the industry. Fortunately, at school, though, I found myself gravitating towards educators of mine that would challenge the system, that would not teach what was prescribed to them that they had to teach. Of course, they did right. And these lessons would stay with me for a long, long time, though I didn't quite use it immediately. So these were lasting lessons. And then, of course, the new South Africa made it possible to meet other people, to meet other cultures. And not only other cultures and other race groups and other people from other countries, but other cultures or race groups from our own country. Other cultures and race groups who literally and figuratively lived on the other side of the line. Tourism was now the new buzzword in the country. And so I made a decision then that here was an economic and job opportunity for myself. Let me go out and do some investigation. And after this investigation, I then decided then to do a course and become a tour guide. And after I then qualified as a tour guide, finding employment was not as easy as the tourism authorities made it out to be. Suppose some of this reasons is because the people who controlled the tour operators who owned them, they still had their own prejudice against other people. They still thought that I didn't have the ability or that I lacked the education. They still thought that they were more superior to me. And of course, not forgetting that I myself lacked the confidence to challenge them on these points. Then there was the elephant in the room, the townships. You couldn't miss it. You could not miss it. Going to and from the airport in Cape Town, the first and the last thing you saw were the townships and the informal settlements in Cape Town. And once I qualified as a tour guide, the type of jobs or the type of work tour operators gave me was the work that no other tour guide wanted to do. The 4 a.m. transfers to the airport or transferring people between the different hotels. And of course, though, I did this. And so for my first 3 months as a tour guide, what this gave me, though, was an opportunity. And this opportunity and the idea came from the tourists themselves, the tourists that I was transferring at 4 a.m. in the morning. They were asking the questions of the townships. They were asking who lived there, where did they come from, are there schools in the area, what's the health of the people like, etc., etc. They were asking all these questions. These questions were asked so often that it became a topic of discussion between a very good friend of mine, Enver Malley. We discussed this over many drinks, I've got to add. And Enver himself, who was a teacher, had just lost his job as a teacher. The government departments were restructuring. South Africa really was nearly bankrupt. People didn't know that. And so there were budget cuts across the board, including education. And so for this reason, Enver was unfortunately or fortunately one of the teachers that lost his job. He did, however, get a severance package. And so when we discussed this township tours, Enver had a small bit of the capital. And the idea of doing township tours was then born, and so grassroots tours was also born. We had very little capital, and Enver was then tasked to do the marketing of the company. I was tasked in trying to set up a tour, or set up a product then. But the struggles continued. When Enver visited the hotels, there wasn't one concierge desk that would say, yes, sure, we'll send our people on the tour. Oh no. No ways. For them, it was, no ways are they sending their guests to the townships. It's too dangerous. Why would people be interested in the townships? Of course, they had their own prejudice that they had to deal with, but they were saying these things, and they were making assumptions and drawing conclusions about the townships, about an area that they themselves have never been in. Me, as the tour guide, trying to set up the product and develop the product, I had resistance from the community themselves. You can imagine that when I spoke to the community about this, they wanted to know, well, who are these people that's coming? I explained to them, well, the people I dealt with were mostly Europeans that were asking me questions about the townships, or they were mostly from America. And of course, through that, I then had to explain that they were mostly Caucasian people that wanted to come into the townships. Now, remember, in the past, the only Caucasian people that the people who lived in the township saw were the security forces of the previous regime. So they weren't very receptive to this idea. But finally, I drew on those lessons from my educators. I went to the tourism authorities and I challenged them about township tours. I challenged them to approach the concierge desks and speak to them and educate them about the townships. I drew on my connections that I had as a student when I was quite active in the political struggle. I made contacts and connections with people who lived in the townships. And I drew on those connections. These connections were now local politicians of the areas. They were the teachers, the healthcare workers, the community workers, but of course, a lot of them were also unemployed. Nevertheless, with their help, we managed to get the community together and hold community meetings. And in these meetings, I would discuss once again the idea of bringing tourists into the townships. But still, I had resistance. Cries from the crowd like, do we look like a circus to you? Are we a safari? Those are the things I had to listen from the community. I had to convince the community, of course, give them ideas and tell them about the possibility or the possible job opportunities that tourism could bring in the area. With the help of my contacts, they too convinced the community that if the tourists came to the townships, they themselves could tell them their stories and not leave it up to the people at the hotels or the concierge desks. They could tell the true story of what it's like living in a township, where they come from, what their hopes and their dreams are. And, you know, so even though we had this resistance, both from the community initially and the concierge desk, Enver and I, we soldiered on. We went ahead, we printed our brochures, and we continued to try and sell this product. And eventually, the people of the township came around, and they bought into the idea of township tours, but there were conditions. Conditions of particularly not having the fishbowl effect. Peter, we don't want you to ride through our streets, our neighborhood, in a bus full of people, with them taking photos out of the window, chucking sweets at our kids, or money at people. No, that's not what it's about. We want the tourists to come and meet us, come and talk to us. We can tell our story. And so you see, it's very important to have community consultation and buying. It's very imperative. And also to know what they want told and the stories that they don't want told. And eventually the township tour was born. And the police came around in the township tour. There's white people in the township, let's protect them. But anyway, township tours were born, it happened, and relationships were eventually formed between tourists and between people living in the townships. Opportunities, job opportunities was created. Sponsorships for soup kitchens, equipment for schools, equipment for sports clubs, even opportunities to travel. I personally know of Rosie, who ran a soup kitchen, and surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, ironically, I should say, is that it was an Irish family who visited her, and because of the connection of Rosie being a Catholic with this Irish family as well, they then bought her a ticket to come and visit them in town, in Ireland. Rosie was never even in the city of Cape Town before. And so these were things that the people in the township gained, but the tourists themselves, they left with insight, they left with hope, they left with friendship, they left with a better understanding of the challenges of South Africa. They left now knowing that South Africa wasn't this wealthy country with beautiful mineral resources like gold and platinum. No, there were plenty of challenges. And they were able to visit the townships then without being awkward. Nowadays, townships, they're accessible to everyone. Communities themselves, or people from the townships, they themselves are now tour operators and taking people in the townships, making it an even more personal experience. Living conditions in the townships for some people have improved tremendously. And of course, job opportunities have also come about, but education is always going to be an ongoing process. Enver today is now in the bodies of tourism authorities himself. And I obviously joined up with Spirit of Africa to continue with them as a tour guide and a travel manager and continue to seek and build new relationships in the township.
So by the end of the late 90s, Peter and I were both involved in little budding tourism operations. And together we started to see them bloom, but all the while guarding our practices against exploitation and against being exploitative ourselves. South Africans have been exploited enough over centuries and particularly recent decades. And as it came out in Peter's stories, in ways that you won't see and you probably wouldn't know too much about, to the very psyche of individuals and into the social fabrics of our communities. So to bring tourists along and exploit them more as a cultural attraction, that was not an option. So moving along a little bit from the adversity and challenges we faced that are related to apartheid, because the only way to not let apartheid win is to move beyond its grip. So after that, out of the 90s, the challenges we faced were a little different, challenged our own morals, where we had to make choices in the decisions we made, really around what path to take. And for us, it was, do we ride the wave or do we pursue our passions? Tourism, the tide that I spoke about, it turned into this glorious wave. Tourists flocked to South Africa for safari, for the garden route, for Cape Town with its winelands and whales. It was really booming. South Africa is mostly seen by the industry as a place where you can really capitalize on its vast and overabundant scenic value, obviously the fauna and the animals and the flora. So there are a plethora of operations that have done the safari product, done the touring product, done the African luxury travel product very, very well, and they've been supremely successful. And so for a long time, we felt like we were swimming upstream against the surge of standard industry products. And we were trying to bring an authentic experience in the cultural and sort of humanitarian side of travel, and also in educational travel. And all the time we were trying to avoid the fishbowl effect of looking into our communities, and we were trying to bridge this divide between us and them, foreigners and locals. We had a passion for the challenges facing our countries, challenges in healthcare, in education, in safety and security, in basic services like sanitation and water and electricity, but we were in tourism. And so somehow we managed to bring these topics and bring these challenges into the South African experiences that we offered. And what we saw transpiring between people, between ordinary citizens when they met and came together around a common topic that we would find, in this case it was music. When you see that exchange happening between people to people, not between tourists and locals or tourists and cultural attractions, that's when we started seeing something really beautiful. And it helped us carry on and pursue this direction that we had chosen. But it was hard. It was really hard. You know, in the face of such popularity of industry products, we were doing something quite different. How do you make money in this scene? By identifying and implementing products that offer authenticity, or by joining the rather competitive herd and going for, benefiting from products that offer a much quicker buck. But beyond choosing that path, there were other challenges. Me. My white face was not the ideal face for a company trying to tell the story of sort of the African side of our world. But that's the beauty of our industry. We bring together our combined perspectives, our combined backgrounds to tell a full story. And beyond that, we were trying to break barriers. The township tours we spoke about are now not questioned. You can book them when you go up Table Mountain at the same time, kind of thing. But at the time, you've got to understand, it was seen as dangerous and threatening and the horrors that take place there. But we knew it was different. So we had to evaluate risks and decide how to insure ourselves. But we really saw that you need to take risks to find the real. And the success of township tours has proven this. We asked ourselves, is it okay to take people on our medical programs into TB clinics and HIV care centers? In the heart of rural KwaZulu-Natal province, at the coalface of these issues, is that okay for tourism? But if we don't, what's the point? What's the point of telling them about it from Johannesburg? They might as well stay in their university in the States and not travel all this way and spend all the money to do that. And all of you know how pressured itineraries are in terms of time. Can we steal time from itineraries to build in service learning? A phrase that wasn't very common quite a little while ago. We believe you've got to practice what you come here to learn. And so we had to steal and convince people that they should do a bit of service learning. Now it's a common request, so now we have to make sure that these experiences are still authentic and not contrived. Is it okay to get your guests in the back of a bakkie with a sedated buffalo and monitor this animal as you take it off in transit? Or is it a little bit dangerous? What's the alternative? You just let them watch all the action, and watch as the vehicle and the experience drives away. Africa is a place where it is infused in our DNA to do. And we wanted to bring this to our travelers' experiences right from the start. They were coming to Africa to do adventure, to get the adrenaline. So we wanted to get them into our lives and into our world and show them that if you engage with more than just the viewfinder on your camera and more than your adrenaline, then your picture of place actually comes more to life.
So we are talking here about authentic tourism. Authentic tourism opportunities to enable foreign visitors to connect on a more meaningful level than a witnessing of local cultures, practices, contemporary lifestyles, and so on. Our industry seems to have moved from a travel and adventure travel to seeking connection. But we don't believe the transition to this most recent space has been embraced effectively or sustainable across the industry. Adventure operators offer activities such as cultural visits, tribal dances, hike tribe treks, township tours, school and orphanage visits, and so on. And in an attempt to answer this need to connect to the local cultures and the people. However, many activities are just a witness to the lives of others. They do not facilitate a true crossing of the foreigner and the local, the divide where there could be a genuine opportunity to mutually understand lifestyles of varying cultures. Typically, these activities are events where foreigners can experience a national geographic moment, highly emotional and therefore strong memory impact. But the only benefit to the local community is that of remuneration for parading out their cultures. Most often, there is very little answering of the traveler's desire to truly connect, and no opportunity for local people to engage a meaningful dialogue with foreigners. However, where this is indeed facilitated and done so in an authentic, genuine manner, true peer interaction is enabled. And there's a large opportunity to build relationships between people of different nations. This is what we believe to be authentic tourism.
Good evening, all. It's a real honor to share my story with you, which kind of started, which is now here, which is a little more with luxury than adventure, I admit, but we do a bit of both. But how it really all started was in 1979, when over a few beers, we decided maybe it's a good idea to jump into and pursue a passion, which was climbing and being in the world of outdoors. So there it was, and we modeled it after this goat, this lovely animal which had this idea of being a sure-footed animal and going to places that others don't. So, of course, it started for me earlier on in this high school. I fell in love with the mountains. You have a vista like this. There are no two options. You fall headlong in love with the outdoors, the mountains of the Himalaya, which, of course, as many of you might know, 73% are in India. And the beautiful flora of the Edelweiss or the orchids are a great way to trap your soul. I joined college at Delhi University with the hope of joining the diplomatic service. And unfortunately, because I was placed 7th in the university, there was a huge pressure by my parents to make sure that I continue on that path. But I was starting to think that maybe studies were getting in the way of my expeditions, so I convinced them somehow to get away to Europe for a year and think before I made my choice. And that's when I went off, and we could only take $500 in those days, because that was the limit. And incidentally, before I proceed, may I just remind that if I slip into the occasional pun, I might be excused, because it might even be a punishment for you at times, but you have to excuse me because I did discover that I'm actually legally allowed because I'm from the land of Punjab, as all Sikhs. So anyhow, so that I was trying to wrap up as many experiences at that time, and this is Tandem's hang gliding in Chamonix, and it's over the town in wintertime, did some Langlof skiing in Scotland, moved on to do some rock climbing not far away from here in North Wales. And I do admit that I had to occasionally read palms to get some rock climbing lessons in the Dolomiti, which would have allowed me to get on to steeper ground like this. This is Glencoe in Scotland, and I became an instructor at the Place Brennan and soon moved on to make the choice. And this was my Robert Frost moment, and I decided to follow my passion. And we came back home. Of course, the kind of Robert Frost moment was a little more frosty at home with the parents, but expeditions started rolling, and we were in business. So there we are. lots of mountains, and this great idea of actually doing product development was wonderful. So that basically meant you could get out on expeditions, explore, and that's the mountain I climbed, Kun, and that's Nun. These are the two 7,000-meter peaks, really popular and being offered by many commercial companies since the 80s. And this was climbing a peak called Z1, which we made the first descent, because for everything we had to experience it firsthand, because that was all going back into product knowledge and to know how to take things forward. About the 80s, we started doing bicycle tours from Delhi to Kathmandu for the guys who were preparing for Tour de France. And I do remember promising myself that I'll do every trip that I offer the client, but this is one thing that I wasn't personally going to repeat. Suddenly, when expeditions were happening, in 1982, suddenly the government closed the Nanda Devi Sanctuary, which is a biosphere reserve, which is about a chunk of 30 mountains being taken away because of the impact by expeditions. So that was a kind of a wake-up call at that time, that if we are in the industry, we really need to be careful about our eco-footprints. We also explored rock climbing potential in India, went on a rock climbing expedition, and it was also time to realize what made sense commercially and what didn't, because this wasn't a money-yielding idea. So I would say it really wasn't a rocking commercial idea. 1986, we discovered that nobody had actually crossed the Thar Desert in India. So we rode on camelback, 450 kilometers, over 10 days, and I lost a lot of friends as well, but did gain a lot of product knowledge. And of course, now I'm very happy to report that we offer deluxe camel safaris, and you can have a sundowner in the evening, and you can also end up in rather nice luxury camps. So if you're doing that, you know you're doing it right. And that's forts and palaces, of course, of Rajasthan, which is where the focus is on a lot of tailor-made holidays. This is the base camp of a beautiful area called the source of the river Ganges. And this is a mountain on the left called Shivling, which is the Matterhorn of the east. And in those days, in the 80s, alpine-style climbing was coming of vogue, lightweight expeditions. So I decided it was time to make an ascent on a technical level, only to see inside the mind of our clients. And that's a nice excuse to get away for 1 month from the desk. Again, this is a wonderful peak called the center of the universe. And in this entire region, it's all steeped by Hindu mythology. So not only are you imbibing culture, but also the sport, of course. And now today, we have excellent climbing offers here. And this is actually a guy called Conrad Anker, very well known in America, who's been coming to the Indian Himalaya and has actually been the ambassador to launch a campaign for the Incredible India Himalaya for 2 years, starting last year. We were happy to receive this accolade, and we're also doing a lot of ski mountaineering, which is quite popular in India. But in the 80s, I also realized that there wasn't much in terms of mountain rescue. And although our adventure travel industry was starting to grow, there wasn't too much protection. So very cheekily, I applied to a grant-giving authority that sent students to Cambridge and Oxford. And I said, how about if we studied mountain rescue? 3 of us got the grant. So we came to Wales, took some training with the RAF as well, and then went back. And of course, Edmund Hillary, luckily, was the ambassador in Delhi, and he was our patron of this project, which we happily called HELP, which is the Himalayan Evacuation and Life-Saving Project, which is really to build capacity in the local people on how to drive the stretchers with wheels, how to do CPR, and so on. And we had doctors based here, and this ran for a couple of years until it got into policy at the mountaineering level, and slowly the structure became tighter. In 1989, I got an opportunity to go to the Arctic, and this for me was a game changer as far as my eco-consciousness was concerned. And it was a wonderful explorer there called Robert Swan from the UK. And the idea was to gather 20 youngsters from 15 different countries and have a high-altitude class and be supported by the United Nations Environment Program and the scientists to say what is going on in the Arctic. And this is what, I forget to mention that Prince Philip, of course, very happily was our patron, and we got great support. So this experiment was a combination of adventure and learning. So with the youngsters and with the scientists, we found that the ozone hole was growing in those days, as many would remember. And then we found PCBs, the pollutants from the industrial waste that was gathering up and going on to the North Pole and settling down and getting into the human chain as a result. So at that point, with all these global issues, what was our learning? The one big learning was that each one of us can make a difference. And for me at that time, I took an earth pledge and I said, I'll do what I can in my daily life and in my business life to make that difference. So we came back and we signed up to the Himalayan Environment Trust, which is a code, Himalayan Code of Conduct for all outdoor journeys. Simple stuff. Don't camp before 100 feet near freshwater streams. Get back your non-biodegradable garbage. No campfires, because in the Himalaya, if you do campfires, the women have to travel further into the forest to collect firewood for what they would use for their cooking. But then I also realized that it was time to get the industry wrapped around, and we had the first signing of the Eco Pledge by the industry under a wonderful organization called PATA. And then we started to produce eco-tourism handbooks and be the advocates of responsible tourism, because it used to really frustrate us when we would find hotels putting effluent in the waters or people doing wrong action, and they would just turn around and say, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't know that we are messing up with the law. So we put in a lot of the law there. We put in some simple actions. And of course, people like Reinhold Messner, who were one of the trustees of the Himalayan Environment Trust, was a great supporter. Around early 90s, we also figured out that maybe we should develop a new product in the Himalaya for winter tourism. And I'd been reading this incredible story of how people have been traveling into this gorge, the Zanskar Gorge, which is way up north in the state of Kashmir, and that linked into the sort of Silk Route trading, where Zanskaris would go from one end and go and trade their butter on the other side and bring back utensils, because it's landlocked for 6 months of the winter. So we said, okay, if we could do a commercial idea out of this, let's try it out. So we made an Indo-British expedition. We were lucky to get the flag from the Explorers Club, and John Hunt, who was the leader of the Everest expedition, was our patron. We also had the support of the local government, the Ministry of Tourism, and we were flown in by a helicopter, which I almost missed, because when we met the general who was giving us the helicopter, he stuck his hand out and he said, I'm General Naranjan Prasad. And very cheekily, I put my hand out and I said, I'm particular Mandeep Singh. Anyway, we did start the ride, but we basically thought if we can go through Zanskar, the gorge, we could stay in Zanskari homes, give them employment through the winter when they don't have anything else, and then end up through this wonderful gorge after a 7 or a 14-day experience. And of course, most people thought it was a gorgeous experience as well, which at times, when you're going at minus 20, even your sense of humor tends to freeze. And I remember Mike, one of the Brits who was with me, incidentally also the founder of Carrymore Equipment, said to me whilst we were wading through a section, and he said, Mandip, how are your feet hurting you? And I said, Mike, feet don't bother us in India. We changed to the metric system. So things like that. Anyway, that was a winter attempt on Stoke Kangri. And now there is winter tourism, as well as snow leopard tracking. And as a result of this, we've got about 400 or 500 people doing this through lots of trekking and outdoor companies. It is a great place for deluxe trekking as well, jeep safaris, and so on. And we can also provide fresh coffee in our deluxe treks. So by around that time, we decided to look at the entire country as an option, because my wife joined in. She was an artist, slightly zany, and said, if we could do all the complicated things, then why don't we do customized holidays of special interest? And that's when we started doing women's tours and also adding in, wherever possible, a humanitarian aspect, going beyond the eco, doing it right, but adding in whatever we could. So here in South India, for example, this lady is the weaver of a sari, which is a very delicate, intricate wear that Indian ladies use in silk. But by the age of 30, they start to lose their eyesight. And so when this group visited, they donated $100 on their trip, and we bought eyeglasses. We hired a doctor, and after the numbers were known, they were given out at a ceremony. Simple things, but and we started to do much more of that in all our tours. These are art tours, and we got into photo tours, and in all, the entire audit system was that when you have hopefully happy clients, what is the extra mile you can go with a humanitarian and an eco injection in that trip? And of course, that's a memory that we always certify for people. It's like with the wildlife, and there was some wonderful chat by, insight by Julian there, that we can all do a little bit of connection between the tourism and what goes downstream to the conservation efforts. So this is a new program that the WWF India has launched, which is basically saying that, look, we've got substantial money for the tiger, but we want to get something for the non-tiger species, and it's a program called Give Back to Nature. So all we do is we put a $2 add into the invoice of every client. We match that $2, and it goes to WWF. But we're also trying to get many others from the tourism industry and from the retail industry so that it really burgeons into a bigger effort, so that whilst the tiger is being saved, you can also focus on to other species. We select lodges according to the TOFT and the eco credentials. There are upmarket lodges. Nikki might recognize this as Banjar Tola, as the and beyond legacy there. And of course, elephant safaris are also possible. Similarly, in Kerala, there's been this wonderful experiment where the poachers were made into game guards, and I know a lot of that happened in Africa as well. And this is something successful, which is now being fed in by the tourism industry. We'd also done an elephant expedition for 101 kilometers, 10 days, bareback, no howdahs, and unfortunately, I lost the friendship of a few more people here. But the point was that we also recognized at that point in Kerala that the NGOs were against elephant riding. So we bowed to their sensibilities, and I think it's important, as we've learned, to always engage with NGOs and to ask what's the other perspective on how they see tourism and so on. And that's something I'll be talking later when we talk about our eco initiatives. That's how we should have really been in Kerala, but in those days, there was no boat, houseboats, and otherwise I would have happily done a houseboat expedition or something, much more comfortable than a bareback elephant expedition, I'm sure. Boutique hotels are there now, and it's a wonderful destination, and light years ahead of any other state in India as far as responsible tourism. And that idea I then took to Eastern India in a state called Nagaland, and that was where we worked with the government and a non-profit for a space of 2 years, where basically we got these pheasant hunters to become tourism guides. Same model, simple principles, get tourism, get the good side of tourism, inject it into communities, and see the magic. So of course, as I said, and this is with the government, they did a pledge-taking ceremony, and the whole village had pledged that there will be no more hunting, only guiding, and today the Blythe pheasant and the tragopan is in healthy numbers. And of course, even there, I might say that they were pheasantly surprised. In the year 2002, I suddenly got involved, called for an Indo-Pakistan friendship expedition in the Swiss Alps. And this was with the view to see if two tourism practitioners could actually raise the voice against the war or the tension that is between the two countries at a glacier, which could then be converted into a World Heritage Site. So Adolphe Auguy luckily became our ambassador for this project. We spoke at the UN, and we've been doing track-to diplomacy ever since, hoping that one day ecotourism can happen in that area, and maybe at some point the armies will come away. In 2003, we did an ecotourism expedition in the Andaman Islands. These islands are between India and Burma, if you think of the map. And basically, we had heard that there was a lot of pressure of tourism which is not being done right. So we thought, let's go, let's map it out. And we saw that there was an impact on the olive ridley turtles nesting because they were allowing people to camp on the beaches, and they were putting on fires because they were feeling cold, and the light of these fires were disorienting the olive ridley turtles. Apart from the other big fact that you were making a big negative impact on the local communities who were technically out of bounds. So we gave a white paper to the government, and we are happy to state that despite being a tourism practitioner, we did not allow tourism to come to the Nicobar Islands, and that's the suggestion we gave. It's still not happening, and we hope if they open it in the future, it'll only be done after responsible tourism actions take place. And the recent, and the most recent initiative is actually a little more ambitious, where we've gone in a small pocket in central India, which is called Chambal. It's a very unique biodiversity place with ravines. And unfortunately, this houses bandits. And these are real bandits that we saw carrying guns, and they occasionally kidnap a person for ransom. So we thought, why not take tourism again? And we worked with the Madhya Pradesh, the state that it is in, with their local state government and the forest department. And we made an expedition, and we spoke to the people. And it's been 2 expeditions down, and we are very close to coming to a point where we want to have in one village a homestay and nature guides being converted through the community. Because they're also savvy enough to realize that if they get good employment, honest employment, obviously they're not going to be chased by the cops. We've also gone into responsible volunteering. And there are lovely organizations like Pack for a Purpose, and it's US-based, and I'm sure many of you are aware that it basically just tells their traveler what the country needs in terms of stationery for schools. You identify the projects, and you bring it, and then you give it out. Of course, the God lies in the giving, and I think it's very important to give it in the right way, because you could, we all know about the begging habit, etc. And so we run spelling competitions, we ask them to plant a tree, care for it, and then you get a prize at the end, etc. So there are lots of that detail that goes in. And in about 2008, the government asked us to form a national body called the Ecotourism Society of India, where we are charged to basically advocate and then certify responsible tourism organizations, be it in the hotel sector, the transport area, or the tour operator segment. And these are the national workshops which we've been holding, some of the books that we produced on best practices. And we've now, last year, got the entire tourism industry to actually take a pledge of sustainability and safe and honorable tourism once again. And very soon, we hope that this will become mandatory before the licenses are renewed, so that this is put on the websites, and therefore, if somebody does not comply with these, you can at least put the pressure. And this, I'm happy to state, was only last month, where we released the 4th edition of the handbook, and this is with the Minister of Tourism. And we also, in this book, have launched the Sustainable Tourism Criteria of India. And this reflects the global sustainable tourism criteria, and it's made for the accommodation and for the tour operating sector. We are now trying to take ecotourism to the next level with using that for gender empowerment, and there's a regional grouping in Asia called the South Asia countries, SAARC countries, and that's what we are trying to do. And of all the certificates that I ever value, I think this gives me the greatest joy, because this reaffirms my belief in tourism. Because when I sit and judge, I see hundreds of great applications. And I think if we can try and see that the best practices of the entire lot could become industry standard, then I think we would be making a great change on this planet. Because ultimately, if you look at what was said in 3rd century BC, in our Vedic thought, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, and that is, the world is one family, and the planet is my home. So looking at the planet and the wonderful diversity and keeping an eye on the commerce, we also decided to start doing a little bit of exploring in the other countries and getting the burgeoning Indian market, which stands at about 12 million outbound, for those of you who are interested, and the inbound to India is about 7 or 8 million. And we, of course, tap into the upper end. So we go on journeys, both Anita and myself. We pledge to do one journey for sure, come hell or high water, and look at our lovely planet, explore it, come back with the knowledge, and put it out commercially. So that's Tibet, Mongolia, Madagascar, Peru, and happily Morocco and Namibia were our last few journeys. And Namibia, a direct result out of being at that wonderful ATTA summit and the Day of Adventure. So, but our core doesn't change. The core philosophy still remains that we dedicate ourselves to those who choose to tread lightly. And as it says, even on our top line of the brochure, and God willing, that will not change. But I do think that every person's vocation, the adventure, we must keep the spirit of adventure alive and not let the catch-22 happen to us, which is as your business grows, you get pinned down to the desk, then there's something wrong, because that's not what we got into this. Because I'm sure we all agree, wealth is acquiring memories, not possessions. And if we believe that, and we convert this message from the Adventure Travel fraternity to our customers, just think of the impact we could have, because I believe that adventure travel has that deep experiential memory that no other tourism can give. And I'd like to end with my favorite quotation, that in the end, only three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things not meant for you. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.